Good morning, everyone. I'm Asha Nayaswami, and we're continuing our shelter in place fireside chats. Let's begin with a prayer. Heavenly Father, Divine Mother, friend, beloved God, Jesus Christ, Babaji Krishna, Lahiri Mahashaya, Swami Sri Yukteswar, beloved Master, Paramhansa Yogananda, saints of all religions, dearest friend Swami Kriyananda, humbly we bow to you all. Open our hearts and minds that we may receive your transforming presence. We are your children. Guide us and bless us that we may follow thy wisdom into our home of perfect bliss. Om. Peace. Amen. I say those prayers every morning, and I don't premeditate them or read them, but I hear my mind. I always say the same thing. Open us to your presence, guide us and bless us and bring us home. Perhaps there's something else that could be said, but that's all that ever occurs to me to say. I think it sums it up pretty well, and there's no point in not repeating it, because it certainly seems required. We're going to continue, and probably all this week. In 1974, on page 77 of this book, Light Bearer, which is a year-by-year account of my 40 plus years with Swami Kriyananda, he listed in 1974, I spoke about this more in the first part yesterday, that just in the context of writing this newsletter that he put out periodically called The Banyan Tree, he wanted to inspire a movement of unity among communities, which he called the Ananda communities movement, because Ananda had certain characteristics as a community. In the 1970s, there were a lot of communities starting. Notably, most of them are not still there, and the whole energy of that time is not in existence right now. There was a huge wave of people trying to find new cooperative ways of living. It'll be interesting to see whenever this COVID-19 cycle ends, we all come out to see what kind of a world we're going to be living in, whether or not some of the ideals that people haven't been paying as much attention to, whether they're going to get a little more attention again. And shared cooperative living might be one of them. So Swamiji listed, six principles that he felt defined an Ananda community as opposed to many others that were there. Yesterday we talked about simplicity, but not primitivism. These are all listed on page 77 of this book. The second one we're going to talk about today is called World Compassion, not World Rejection. And each one of these is, a lifelong study. And so we're going to spend, I think, most of today on this one. There's always been, especially in Western spirituality, well, actually in all spirituality, there's been sort of two ways that you can go about becoming a completely dedicated spiritual person. And one is to isolate yourself in the world, and the other is to serve the world. That's sort of how it's been understood. So in India, you would renounce the world and go off to the Himalayas, or you would go live by the Ganges somewhere. I saw a documentary recently about sadhus who just live in the city of Varanasi and live by the river Ganges, and they have no practical involvement with the world except people who come to them sometimes for rituals or for blessings, and they live off of charity. It's really quite an unusual and an astonishing life. In Autobiography of a Yogi, Master talks about Babaji and his disciples who live in the Himalayas. Babaji is quite involved with serving the world, and that's what I'm going to talk about, but they live quite far away from it. In the early days of Christianity, the Desert Fathers just left the world completely behind. and went way out in the desert to live, sometimes living in abandoned tombs, in caves, just paying no attention to the world whatsoever. Christian monastics often go into deep seclusion, often into silence, living holy contemplative lives, the Trappist monks. Those ways of life are not as popular as they used to be, but they've always been an alternative, that I'm not going to be involved in the world. Now, what Swami writes about here in world rejection is even a step further, which is that the world is I don't have to pay any attention to the world. And Swamiji talks about, from the point of view of true divine realization, we can reject involvement in the world, but we can't reject the need to love as God loves, because the divine is completely involved in the world. If God lost interest in us, we would simply cease to be. We literally live by the power of the divine, which is flowing into us, and as soon as that power is withdrawn, the body has no power on its own to be animated. And that is the love of God giving us life. Where does life come from? I've never been pregnant myself, but the miracle of it is self-evident to me. People have sexual relationships a great deal of the time, but only sometimes does that spark of life result from that sexual union. And then all of a sudden a new life is growing inside the female body and will finish its cycle and demand to be launched into the opportunity to have this world. There's this power that's coming through that gives us this opportunity to have a physical body, and in a human body, we have the potential to actually become infinite in our consciousness while still living in this body. That's what makes the human body unique, is that the nervous system is sufficiently refined for us to be able to live, to perceive the material and the infinite world at the same time. So compassion for the world, Swamiji has talked about at different times, that a person can reject the world with two different attitudes. One can be one that I simply don't want to be involved in that world, but that doesn't mean I don't continue to bless it. And then another way of doing it is, it doesn't matter, nothing matters except my self-realization. So when Swami's talking about the way that Master presented the way we should follow our spiritual life, world compassion, not world rejection. And that means that the attitude of concern and the desire to take whatever blessings are given to us and to share them with everyone is inherent in the right exercise of spiritual life. Swami talks about various examples where in rejecting, in moving away from involvement with the world, people also close their heart to the suffering of others. Now, this is a really important point, because I gave just a couple of days ago, I was reading a Bhagavad Gita verse for a different series, a webinar I do as a series on Swamiji's commentary on the Bhagavad Gita. And Swami's whole trajectory of that commentary and the whole essence of that class was how consciousness is the primary way in which we can serve and help others. And what often happens on the yogic path when a person becomes devoted to meditation and to self-realization is that they simultaneously may lose an interest they may have had before in what I would call political activism, or in trying to change the conditions of this world. And then sometimes yogis who cease to be involved in political activism are accused of closing their hearts. And thus self-realization, the quest for self-realization, can often be condemned as being selfish, because instead of out there serving the poor and trying to find housing for the homeless, or working for political change, we're, quote, just meditating. Well, it is possible when we begin to turn our attention inward, and this does happen, and it has to be said out loud, that sometimes people do just become preoccupied with their self-realization. And there is a way of interpreting the teachings that could tell you that just the only duty that you have is for self-realization. But Master expanded that to say our self-realization comes when we recognize our oneness with all of creation. And this is a quality of highly advanced souls that, for me, in my many years of relationship with Swami Kriyananda, it was something that took me a long time to understand. Because part of the reason people get drawn to the spiritual path is that life is very hard. And there's a great deal of disappointment in this life, and there's a great deal of heartbreak in this life. And sometimes the more sensitively we become aware of all the disappointment and heartbreak, not only in our own lives, but in the lives around us, it becomes unbearable. And the desire to renounce the world is just a desire to protect ourselves from the assault on the tender heart. And I know in the course of many incarnations for myself, um, I have become aware that one of the primary ways I dealt in the past with the inevitable difficulties of life was to harden myself a little bit. A friend of mine told me about what she believed was a past life of mine. I don't know if it's true. I've sort of come to accept it as true. And I know when she first told me it, it actually brought tears to my eyes. And for a long time, whenever I would speak of it, it would bring tears to my eyes. So whether that was compassion for a good story or the memory, I just don't know. But I developed for a time a phobia about when I was traveling, and I traveled a lot during that time, that I had to have my travel companions with me at all times. If my travel companions in the airport, for example, went off to do something else and I was sitting alone at the gate, I would become quite panicked that they were never going to return. And it is assumed rather dramatic proportions for a while. And if anybody left me, I had to make them absolutely swear that they would be back by an exact period of time. And even as the time came, I would become very anxious. Finally, I talked myself out of it with reason. But when I was talking about it in the satsang, a woman who has some psychic ability came up later and she said to me that she saw me as a child of about 6 or 7, and I was the only child of a father who had been widowed, and he couldn't take care of me. And we were very poor, and he couldn't take care of me. So we went together on a train, and he took me some distance from where we lived, and we went out on the platform together, and then he abandoned me. And I became one of those children. And in my mind, this is always in India, because I've seen abandoned children in India. And from then on, I just had to make my own way in my life. And when she told me that, I had two flashes. First, I mean, I also felt very emotional, but I said, that was a very hard life. And then I said, but it made me very strong. And then I said, but I developed some bad habits in that lifetime. Because in order to survive, I had to harden. I didn't survive by expanding and surrendering. I survived by hardening like this. And I developed willpower, and I succeeded. I don't think I remained impoverished in that life, but I developed strengths and weaknesses in that life, which carried over into this one, which is, I think, why the apocryphal or the truth of it came forward. So when I saw Swami Kriyananda being able to navigate through the world with tremendous tremendous care for people, understanding and concern, I assumed he did it by hardening his heart, by suppressing, which is what I was doing. And it served me to believe that's what he was doing, because that's what I was doing. And if he wasn't doing that, it presented in front of me a challenge I wasn't ready to face. But gradually I learned that that wasn't at all what Swami was doing. Swami had had tremendous compassion for the world. And the compassion he felt didn't frighten him. And the compassion he felt was in balance with his capacity to serve them. See, I think a lot of times, at least speaking for myself, the reason I closed is because I didn't know what to do. You see all this suffering around you. You see people are hungry. You see people homeless on the streets. I mean, I don't have to enumerate it. We all know what it is. And I didn't know what to do about it. And feeling helpless and overwhelmed, the only way to cope was to diminish my sensitivity. But of course, doing that's well, let me give lots of parts of that. You see, what Swami had come to understand, and I've talked about this aspect of Swamiji in others of these conversations recently, because it's such an important thing from my perspective. And I usually talk about how he wasn't afraid of suffering. And I was very much afraid of suffering. And since I've dealt with that in other talks, I'm not going to go there. But what I also understand is Swami understood the proportion of God's responsibility and his responsibility. In other words, his sense of himself was balanced. And, and humility, the ability to actually overcome the ego, is not by suppressing the ego, not by just saying either I'm terrible, I'm nothing, I can't do anything, or I won't do anything. True humility is self-honesty, which is we have certain capacities, we have certain talents. To say that we don't is to deny the God within us in a very real sense. God gives us these abilities and the desire to express them. That's God-given. But we're not in charge. And our preferences express only the limit of our ability to understand right and wrong, happiness and suffering. Whereas God's perception of reality is based on a completely different sense of time and space and purpose and reality. I had tremendous faith in what Swami Kriyananda said and did. I developed that faith almost instantaneously. I perceived his consciousness before he spoke the first time I met him, and my perception never changed. I felt him to be a free soul. Why I would think I had the right to make that judgment, I don't know. But years of living with him, I couldn't imagine how you could be less bound by ego and more free in the spirit than Swami was. And every experience I had with him confirmed it. But what it also did was when Swami contradicted my preconceptions of how a person of his consciousness should behave, rather than using his behavior to prove that he wasn't what I thought he was, or to hold him accountable for not meeting my standards, I was far more inclined to think, if a person of his consciousness behaves that way, I wonder what he's doing. I didn't know the phrase reverse engineering, but I've learned it since, where you start with a certain conclusion and then you understand why it's true. Now, yes, of course, that can also be rationalization, but it can also be that you say, if this is the premise, if he is acting out of intuitive understanding of a higher truth, then what might that higher truth be? And I came to this picture that I actually had demonstrated for me not until 2012, which was much later. No, I had it earlier because I traveled some early on after we wrote this cookbook of all things, and I went to television stations and I cooked zucchini burgers on television. I took a tour from Seattle all the way to Houston, Texas over 3 months, and we were advertising the cookbook, and I would cook zucchini burgers on television. I tend to forget about that. It's a rather forgettable part of my life, but I did it. Anyway, so I saw what television was like, which is quite different than radio, because television, your face is there. So I would be with these hostesses and we would be sitting in some little living room thing, just like I'm doing right now, because I'm sitting here in the little living room with the camera and the lights and the techies on the other side. And then the television thing, on the screen, you'd see this much. But there was all this stuff just 2 feet away that was going on. And the reason I mentioned my hostess is because my hostesses were always knew where the cameras were. They were always in the cameras. Radio was much more fun because there was no visual, and so the person could actually relate to you. On television, they were always relating to the camera, and then I was kind of like an incidental part of them relating to the camera, and I really didn't enjoy it very much. Only a few television people that I found actually could relate to me and not to the camera, but that's beside the point. But what I realized is this is what you see. And in 2012, when we made a movie, Finding Happiness, it was, the scene around was even more complex for what ended up on the screen. And I realized that my perception of people, of situations, of reality tended to be the screen of my consciousness, however big my consciousness was. And so something would enter my awareness over here, it would cross the screen, and with this evidence, I would come to certain conclusions. And given the evidence, I wasn't stupid. I had a lot of faith in my own understanding. And given the evidence, I was often right, not always, but often. But I realized with Swami, is it his screen? I couldn't put any edges to his screen. And so he would start with who knows what understanding of what this person really needed. And then it would cross the screen of my understanding, and I would have nowhere where he was going, but Swami would respond in this context. He rarely talked about his own expanded abilities, but on more than one occasion, he said, all I have to do is look in someone's eyes for a moment and I understand their whole consciousness. So often, what was incomprehensible to me was just simply he understood. He understood where they were coming from, what they needed, and where they were going. I mean, incarnations before, incarnations to come, this one, I couldn't say. But he was seeing it from God's perspective. And so he didn't have to protect himself from what was happening on the screen right now because he knew that God was taking the soul, that the divine was equally present in everyone, and that this person's destiny, no matter what the small reality they were living in, was going to be perfect bliss. And he had more courage in his faith. He wasn't afraid for himself of what he would have to go through in order to act out whatever it was that God wanted to express through him. And he wasn't afraid for other people to do it either. And he also didn't feel that it was either his responsibility or his right to try to protect them from their own destiny. So his compassion, in a very powerful way, was much more powerful than mine because he had faith that people could do it. And you see, that's what he communicated to me. That's what I experienced from him. What I experienced from him was that whereas I was terribly afraid that I couldn't do it, he was always confident that I could. Just this, and he didn't make a big deal about it. He didn't stand on the side and cheer me. He never flattered me. He was appropriate in his praise, but never extravagant. You could always believe exactly what he said. When I used to do writing and he'd have to evaluate it, he would say, this is fine, this is okay, this is good, this is very good, this is excellent, this is fine work. He was precise. And I could always tell that this was okay, we could use it, but this was really a fine piece of work. So there was absolute trust, but never hyperbole, never just sort of building you up for the sake of making you feel proud, because he knew we could do it. And see, if you know someone who can do it, then you can be sympathetic with their present difficulties, but you're not afraid. And this is what the compassion that Ananda was built on, has been built on, is the compassion of faith in God. And faith in God's equal love for everyone, and faith in the power of God in each one of us. And that doesn't mean there aren't some hard days, that there aren't a lot of really hard days. And so to hold the heart open in compassion for the world and to realize that what gives us the power to have that compassion is the strength of our own inner relationship with God. And this is where self-realization, true self-realization, and the effort to achieve it becomes the exact opposite of selfishness. Because when I was much earlier in my life, had no idea how to expand my consciousness, and the limits of my understanding was what my ego could do. And I was perfectly aware that my ego was completely helpless against the magnitude of the nature of this planet and this particular yuga where there's so much dark and light playing against it. I mean, many people who go out to save the world end up utterly disillusioned. And I started out before I was found the spiritual path, which fortunately I found very early, just sort of trying to touch into what seemed to be what a person of my temperament would do, which is I would try to help. But I just didn't know how to help. You could feed a few hungry people. You could give away at that time what little money I had. You could try to go to an underprivileged neighborhood and try to read to children who didn't have a family that would read to them that much. But the whole thing just completely overwhelmed me. But when I got onto the spiritual path and I realized if I become deeper in my faith and experience of God, and if I stop being afraid of my own suffering, and I stop being afraid of your suffering, because your suffering is not without purpose. If nothing else, and this is what I often say to myself, it's horrible experiences like this that awaken in us the absolute need to find God. And that's not rationalization, that's the truth. I just have to look at myself. If you know yourself, you know everyone, because we're all human beings together. And I have to say, I would not be driven to realize God if this world had not disappointed me as much as it has. And my life is wonderful. Don't misunderstand me. But we have to recognize the limitations of worldly happiness before we will put out the effort to seek God. So if I see people in all walks of life who haven't yet come to realize that everything they seek will be found by changing their consciousness and growing closer to God, and as a consequence, they're not as happy as they want to be, or even they're deeply miserable. It's not that I don't feel it, because I do, we all do. But I also realize because of this, great joy is going to come to you. And that great joy would not be possible, that freedom would not be possible, that confidence that life has a purpose, and one can't convey that with words alone. That has to be what we know. And that is part of what Ananda is. The reason we seek God is because we know that as we uplift our consciousness, we will be able to express the tender desire of the heart to help others. A dear friend of mine said it so perfectly. He said, if realizing God would just help me, he said, it wouldn't be worth the effort. He said, but I make the effort because I know that as I uplift my consciousness, I will be able to help others much more. You see, we haven't turned our back on the world. We've turned our faces toward God, our hearts toward God, and stretched out our hands to bring everyone who is willing to come with us. God bless you.